do we have questions from the audience? If so, I think we've got a microphone. We're going to steal one from up here. And just give us your name and your question, and a real question. And we would love to have members of the panel respond. Is anyone? Well, while you're thinking some more or working, oh, we've got one right here on the end. Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Oh.
Thought we were going to have folks line up.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
Thank you. My name's Priya. My question is for anyone on the panel who would like to answer it, I suppose. But how do you see the impacts of climate change on agriculture playing out politically, sort of with respects to the competitiveness of biofuels compared to other forms of renewable energy like wind or solar?
Sure.
You'll have to reach
Thanks, Priya. That's a great question. It's funny, I'm not normally the most liberal person on a panel, but I will definitely fire up about this. No, look, huge impacts, and I think that, yeah, the impacts of climate change that have on food security are no longer an abstraction. I think, the impacts of the drought they had in the US, we are seeing certainly just domestic food price spikes that resulted directly from the lack of availability of water, and the IPCC's recent fifth assessment report sort of beyond any unequivocal doubt portrayed that climate change was a direct impact on some of these great food security threats, and that's not just in the US, that's globally as well. And I guess to talk about sort of the energy question, I come back to this quantification of benefits and externalities. Sure, there might be some incremental benefits of switching to some use of biofuels, be they cellulosic or corn-based, but there are far easier ways in which we can achieve energy security. I mean, the fossil fuel industry receives something like 600 billion subsidies, and talking about the vested interests that Joel was talking about, I mean, that's where it starts. I mean, all we have to do is just shift some of those subsidies towards renewable energy systems which meet energy access requirements, they meet peak demand. I mean, that's a fallacy that they can't. They have none of these social externalities. We can forget about the climate question when it comes to biofuels. I mean, there's other easier ways to achieve energy security.
Great. Other questions? Great. Got a couple of them.
Sure. Thank you. My name is James. Well, I'd assume all of you agree that the private sector plays a very important role in the food economy overall. What strikes me as clear on the one hand is that there are plenty of opportunities for sophisticated institutional investors to play in that market, and I wonder if there are enough opportunities for individual investors to become more involved and to gain greater access to liquidity, for example, through ETFs. Is that something that you think is a problem that needs to be addressed?
Use words that only a finance person knows.
I think that ETFs can offer liquidity. However, in a volatile market, when things go wrong, liquidity dries up. I think one of your points may be that the institutional investor or the private sector can leverage more than you or I could on an individual basis. And to Joel's point earlier, the markets, as efficient as they are also driven just by huge dollars. So yes, you have an opportunity to play in the agricultural market via an ETF. The question is, what is the benefit you're looking for relative to this conversation, or is it just more you're just trying to figure out how to be involved with that financial instrument on a non-leveraged basis?
I guess my question would be more directed at the need for increased capital in the food sector generally in order to produce positive results. And if you're trying to increase capital, one way to do that would be to bring in more individual investors
true. However, I think if you look at the large institutional investors, you would need a population of this country to match the dollars, because you're talking about billions and trillions of dollars in these marketplaces. And so the average person isn't going to have that investable income, especially not in the economy of the last, say, 5-6 years, to do so. I think that I don't think that the individual investor is necessarily going to add or benefit to the financial market in the way that you're thinking, because their orders are going to be loose. Like in the stock world, you'd be talking about 100 lots, 100 shares, but really institutions are trading in blocks. A lot of it is happening over the counter, or OTC, so to speak, upstairs, black box. That's a conversation for a different day, but I don't think that my mom, you, and your Aunt Millie are really going to have an effect on the market. I understand the aggregate dollars look like it's there, but it will just be loose and disjointed, and it's not going to help the liquidity.
Great. Thank you. Yes, we have a
Hi, my
question.
name's Jay. You guys mentioned the sort of political deadlock that's happening right now, where there's very little communication between experts and politicians. And from my perspective, it seems to only be getting worse. It seems like a general question, but how do we solve that? How do we get through to the supposed movers and shakers or whomever?
That's how I spend a lot of my time. We need a broad-based people's movement to take our country back for the people. I believe we need a constitutional amendment on campaign finance reform and dramatic change from the top bottom. I wrote a book on hunger a few years ago, and I had the proposition that hunger used to be a bipartisan issue. In the 1970s, we almost entirely ended hunger in America, and Senator Bob Dole, conservative Republican from Kansas, worked very closely with Senator George McGovern, a liberal Democrat from South Dakota. And I basically said, let's fix hunger and then use this as a way to prove to the American political system we can work together and fix the rest of the problems. And unfortunately, in the 6 years since I've written that, I've come to the very depressing conclusion that we can't even fix something as easy as domestic hunger, which really is a snap to fix, unless we fix our political system first. And so, but don't think this is hopeless. We were told slavery was inevitable. We were told child labor was inevitable. We were told that people didn't matter. And dollars aren't buying votes. They are buying the ability to influence people. And if people remain uninfluenced, those dollars don't work. And so if people say, oh, it's hopeless, all the money people control, that's just a cop-out. Our forefathers fought a lot harder fights than this and didn't whine about it. It's all of your jobs as citizens to fight back and reclaim your country.
Yes, please. Sasanka.
That's a really good question. Before I get to it, something just popped into my head to your question as well. And I don't know if it's entirely relevant, but in terms of sort of looking at the role of sort of large-scale private sector investments in agribusiness, there's an incredible role to play for small-scale agriculture. And I'm not just talking about sort of co-ops and things that we're involved in ourselves, but small-scale sort of farming extension sort of type services and small-scale farmers play an incredible role in the developing world. I think 2/3 of the developing world supply themselves through small-scale farming. There's agroecological models which are far more sustainable and have far better impact for local employment benefits, for sort of local supply chain implications. And there's a huge body of work to look at the role that small-scale farmers can play. So it's not just a case of bigger is beautiful. So that's just sort of another spin on it. And to your question, someone once asked me, globally, what do you think are the top 3 things if you could wave a magic wand to try and fix globally? And my number one thing was campaign finance reform in this country, the United States. I'm Australian, in case if the accent wasn't given away. Number 2 was congressional redistricting in this country. I think, those 2 things could just have such an implication for the inequality debate that we're trying to sort of fight. It's baffling sometimes. And then fossil fuel subsidies, I think, are the root of all evil. But I will say that it is absolutely not hopeless. And I think just having an informed debate, so I think the role that all of you are doing just by turning up here is incredibly important. I mean, like I said, these are serious policymakers who are trying to tweak the numbers on the potential greenhouse gas benefits that the RFS had. Now, we're smart enough to try and refute that, and we need to raise the awareness. I think having this dialogue is a step to sort of creating that sort of citizenry movement.
So are you an NYU student? Yeah,
Yes.
Yes. No? Okay, so it's just interesting because, I teach in the Master's Food Studies program, and most of my students are extremely interested in developing skills to go out and make serious changes in the food world, but it's really not unlike making changes in the political world. So I guess I jokingly say that, for my generation, my job is to pass on information, maybe help you develop more critical skills, but I think the job of the next generation, the people in their 20s and early 30s now, is really to develop these more citizen-based movements in the areas of political negotiations, in how our food system is set up, how we set policy around fuel, and really the conversations are part of it, but I also think your generation's job is to figure out the right types of action to take based upon maybe the work that the people ahead of you have done. So I don't think it's hopeless. I'm really hopeful. I meet young people every day that are really committing their lives to trying to make this very significant change. So I think working in that context, I can't tell you what the future will look like, but I feel very hopeful that your generation will be able to do something that makes a difference. See how lucky I am? I get to teach people like that.
I think that I was at the Restaurant Association board meeting today, and I didn't read the article or see the piece, but I think there was a student in the Midwest who had basically called out Coke and Pepsi for an additive that was in both Powerade and Gatorade. So you all seem to be more knowledgeable than I am, but it basically was it started with social media. It started with their iPhone or whatever, their tablet. They called out a company, and it started to change the way that company needed to think, because you can now get called out and get mass appeal on your side as a layperson, and then it just builds momentum from there. So I think that one of the greatest things that we can all do now, and going back to the earlier point, is you have to make your point known, and you have to be an influencer. And everybody now who has an iPhone can be an influencer. You can tweet it, you can Facebook post, you can Instagram. I don't need to tell you, most of you are younger than I am, but that's how impact is being made now, and that's how I think that we'll get a shift in policy, which is going to be disjointed at first, but the more people doing the same thing and starting to analyze and looking at things, and then getting that information out there, assuming that it's actually correct information, will have an impact. Some of you may think that that's positive, and others may think that that's negative, but the only way to do it is have your voice heard, and it's easier now than ever.
And I would add, or underscore the informed part and the accurate part, and there is actually a rise in this. It would seem odd and seem obvious, but there's a rise in a movement around evidence-based policymaking and embedding that in departments, agencies, and the entire policy process. It is a little more complicated than it would sound, because you have to determine which instruments and tools you're going to use to get the evidence, but an informed citizenry armed with actual data and accurate information, I think, can be very, very powerful. I think we had one more question. Yes. And please give us your name.
Sure. It's Hasina. So I am still kind of forming my opinion on biofuels and their sustainability, both economically and environmentally. So I was kind of wondering what you guys thought of the sustainability of biofuels such as ethanol.
I think.
I have one question. Can you define the word sustainable?
So sustainable as in, I think, agriculturally sustainable for this country, since you said, I think it was Dr. Carolyn that said that there's only a certain amount of land for, agricultural production. So do you think that biofuels would be a good investment, a sustainable investment in our fuel future?
Well, that's a great question. I think I've certainly voiced my opinion, but I think the question that Dan asked about, what do we mean by sustainable, is very pertinent and may maybe speak to the point I'm trying to make. I think fundamentally in any type of intervention or policy decision, it boils down to two things. Are we going to hurt anyone? And is this actually going to benefit everyone? And you know, that can be sort of then, you can extrapolate that to the benefit everyone is trying to define an actual true public interest. So make sure that it's going to actually trickle down to those who deserve it, who need it, and at the same time making sure that the negative impacts or the negative externalities, that word I keep using, get quantified. And in saying that, I think that when you look at all of the metrics associated with the environmental impacts I talked about and certainly the detrimental impacts on food prices, I don't think that there is certainly not the level of emphasis placed on biofuels. I think that can certainly have a role to play, and I'm sure, you know, there's in terms of third generation and the celluloistic, you know, there could be a role in terms of agro waste. But if you got to have those standards and those principles. Are you going to hurt anyone? Is this actually going to benefit people? And make sure you've got environmental and social protections in place. And that is a way to make that call.
And I just make the simple point that this is about trade-offs, and none of them are easy. If you think about even the most benign kind of energy production, windmills, that certain pro-environment left-wing liberals, when they want to build windmill farms not far outside of their window in Cape Cod, came up with all sorts of objections to them. You know, they'd hurt bird migration, they'd hurt their view. And you know, the fossil fuels, you know, there's no good way to get it. You know, clean coal is sort of a misnomer. We know there's a big national debate over, you know, fracking. You know, sort of oil production ain't too whippy either. I sort of like Alaska. And so we do have to understand that there is a price to modernity. And that we need a balanced energy policy. Certainly I'd supporting more alternative fuels, but we have to admit that there's no answer tomorrow. And even some environmentalists are even saying, well, maybe nuclear if we had you know, proper, you know, protections. I don't support that, but these are very, very hard trade-offs.
So I think a really key part of this debate for sustainable is that sustainable is not about today. It really is about intertemporal trade-offs. And so, and again, it goes to how do you pose your question? Are you looking at, if you are talking about, is biofuel production consistent with sustainable agricultural food production? Probably not. But I think it's how you phrase the question, and you think about what are you going to leave for future generations. And so there's a really interesting article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives by Robert Solow over what is the definition of, what does he mean by sustainable? So I actually think that's a really nice starting place. I would tell you exactly what he said, but I read it at the beginning of the semester. I can't remember exactly now, but it was very inspirational because he just talks about how do we look at sustainable and what does that mean about what we're leaving for the future? And so I think that would be the way I would ask that question. And I clearly don't have the answer to that because it depends upon your objective function. I know, I saw your hand going. It's okay.
The reason that I asked what your definition was of sustainable is we had a discussion a few years back when I was up at Blue Hill at Stone Barns. So obviously we're talking about the restaurant, but it's very related to the center itself. And the beverage director basically posed the question, is it better to get Chardonnay from California or white Burgundy from France? Because we had French wine on the menu, which seemed a little bit antithetical to the message of the restaurant doing things more local, more sustainable, domestic. What we came down to was the fact that you have to truck California wine 2,500 miles, but you get to send ocean freight from the west coast of France to Port Elizabeth, New York, which is actually more fuel efficient. So sustainability is it local community sustainability on an economic level? Is it agricultural sustainability and environmental? Is it economic, macro picture? Like what does that mean? And that's why I asked, because the analogy that I just made relative to what you're saying is, wow, it almost looks like you should buy French wine because it has a lower environmental impact. However, then you have to back into other aspects, which is how were the grapes grown? Were they sprayed? Was it versus biodynamic? Are they organic? Do they use equipment to do the harvest, or are they hand harvested? So you don't know all of the answers to these questions. I don't either, so don't feel bad. But it really depends on what you want to define sustainable as.
Just thinking it could make for a very long trip to the grocery store.
Shopping with me is horrendous. Just ask my wife.
Well, I want to ask you to thank the members of the panel for being here this evening. And certainly we want to thank you all for being here and for such terrific questions. And I'm going to turn this back over to Brett.
Another round of applause, please, for all our speakers. I just want to quickly thank our co-host, Smarter Fuel Future, our co-sponsors, NYU Oxfam and the NYU Environmental Studies Club. Thank you again. Look forward to speaking with you.